Hi there, welcome back to our mapping of the PMBOK Guide 6th edition. So we've looked at the board, we've looked at the processes, we've looked at the idea that this was a mapping, some kind of a mapping, like as if you had the 50 states of America, but on one page you had them listed alphabetically or in groups, but when you zoomed it out and you could see them as a map with their relationships to each other. And the relationships is caused by the inputs and outputs. So the outputs becoming inputs, and you'll be able to see that as we do this exercise. So what we're going to do is go relatively quickly through these. Now the color coding is not so great for the camera, but this is the project charter. And obviously that's an output from develop the project charter. That makes sense. But also the assumptions log, which is something that's interesting here, something we deem to be true. Okay, so following on from that, you have the project charter and the assumptions log. Then we have the stakeholder register. Now the stakeholder register is an obvious output here. We also have change requests. You can see this down here, kind of a strange place to have change requests, but you get the idea. Change requests will be processed way over here. But I think they get the idea that there might be some changes that need to be considered in what's called a rolling wave planning. Now, in develop the project management plan, of course, obviously we're going to have the project management plan as an output. Now in plan scope management, we have two, and it's interesting. We have the scope management plan, of course, as the main one, but then the requirements management plan. So an offshoot of that, just looking after the requirements, and we'll see the traceability matrix later, but now we have the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. And then I think it makes sense that we would have the schedule management plan as the output from plan schedule management. And so basically it says on the label, project charter is project charter, the stakeholders is the stakeholder register, the scope management plan, the schedule management plan, and of course then you can follow on with the cost management plan. So the cost management plan gives us these rules of the road, which are now organizational process assets. We've updated them, we've customized them, we've tailored them, if you want to use that word. And then we collect the requirements. Now to collect the requirements, and again, the dog got this one, but the requirements documentation is the main one that we're going to be looking at, whether this is in specifications or drawings, whether it's in pictures, it's the requirements documentation. So requirements coming from the stakeholders. And then we have this one called requirements traceability matrix. Now the requirements traceability matrix allows us to trace the requirement back to the stakeholder, but also trace it forward to the work. Okay, so we're going to see that the traceability matrix works in two directions. Important one for you to know, the scope statement. So the scope statement is strong PMBOK deliverable. It's the project scope statement, not the statement of work, which is under contract with a vendor. But we have the scope statement here, comes out of this one, define the scope. So collect the requirements is all the requirements, whether they're in, they're out. And define the scope tells us which ones are in. It might also give assumptions and constraints as well. Now, of course, we understand the work breakdown structure is a work breakdown structure as an output, but in this case, we're calling it the scope baseline. So here's the first of the three baselines. We're going to see the scope, we're going to see the schedule, and we're going to see the budget. But at the moment, we just have one, which is the scope baseline. Okay, so then following on from that, you can see some other outputs here. We're going to be looking at define the activities. Of course, these can all happen now in parallel once we have the work breakdown structure. Now, because the activity is a subset of the work breakdown structure, we do the decomposition, but we produce a few things. The first one is the activity list. That makes sense. Okay, there's an activity list. The second one will be the milestone list, which is milestones, these major events for the client that will celebrate at some point in the future. And then perhaps the activity attributes. It's useful to have that as well. And we also have change requests coming in here. And again, the change requests will be processed way over here, but you get the idea that there might be some things that need to be changed. Personally, I don't like to see change requests in planning. It's part of the negotiation, part of the informal back and forward of planning. But of course, once we get over to here, well, then we do need to have the change requests more seriously. Okay, let's have a look on sequence the activities. What do you think the output is going to be? And it's called a network diagram. Okay. Project schedule network diagram, and that makes sense. Now, when we estimate the durations, there's going to be two things, and it's the same for all the estimating that you see. We'll have the duration estimates, that'll be one, but we'll also have the basis of those estimates. What was the background information? How did you get there? So that's a good one to have as well. Now we look at schedule. And developing the schedule, you can see, has quite a lot of outputs, again, the change requests that I mentioned. But now we have the project schedule itself and then the schedule baseline. So the idea that they're recognizing that you'll have a baseline and then you'll have the working version, and you compare the working version to the baseline, okay? We'll also have the project calendars, which are very helpful to us, the project calendars. And then we have the schedule data. The data is going to help us to build some models if we need to. So project calendar is very important, not the resource calendars. We don't know the resources yet, but we do know that the project will happen over Diwali or Ramadan over the winter, or whether it's the winter in the Southern Hemisphere. We now know the project schedule, the project calendars. Now, when we estimate the costs, as you know, we're going to have those two that go together. So now in this case, we'll have our cost estimates, and the cost estimates will always have the basis of the estimate. So again, we have the basis of the estimates. Determine the budget, as you can see, has two things there that we need to consider. And obviously we have our scope baseline here. We have our schedule baseline here. So it makes sense that we would have our cost baseline here. So now we've got the three baselines, and that's how we get there. Scope comes first, schedule comes second, and budget comes third. Remember, budget and funding. Funding is what is allocated. Budget is what is calculated based on all of this. Now we do know, we'd like to know what is the project funding requirements, like what is the project funding requirements. And so now we can understand that maybe there's not enough funding, or maybe I need the funding at different times of the year outside of the normal tranches or release. So we have the project funding requirements. Okay, let's have a look at risk. And obviously out of this thing called plan risk management, you can imagine we have the risk management plan. It kind of makes sense. Now, in identify risks, we can say that there's two outputs. The main one, of course, would be the risk register, just as we have a stakeholder register here. We'll have a risk register here. But there's a new one now, which is called a risk report. Now, the risk report is similar to the quality report, but it's a narrative description rather than an Excel sheet. So it'll be a report on the risk activities and their conformance to the plan. Now, we have two types of analysis. And what I've done here is I've put in the risk register, even though it's kind of implicit in the PMBOK. But obviously what's happened here is that we take the risk register and we prioritize it. Now we do the same here and we prioritize it. So in these cases, both of these cases, because we've done the analysis, we now know a prioritization, if you want, a hierarchy. So we have high, medium, low, or actual quantification numbers here. But either way, this risk register is the same as this, except now it's prioritized. And of course, following on from that logic, now my plan risk responses will also have a risk register, but in this case, it's been reduced. Now the reduce has been reduced or increased for opportunities, but primarily it's going to be reduced. Now, plan quality management. Plan quality management is going to give me two things. It's going to give me the quality management plan, as you can imagine, that says on the label. So it makes it very good. And the quality metrics, okay, the numbers that we're going to be using, the measurements that we're going to be using as we go into quality. So we're going to plan the quality and then assure the quality and then control the quality. So it's going to be very simplistic in that sense. Plan, do, check, okay? Now, plan resource management has two things that are of interest to us. And the first one is, of course, the resource management plan. Now, the resource management plan, of course, will be put here. It's the output of plan resource management. It makes sense. It's on the label. But the other one that's interesting here is called the team charter. Now, the team charter is maybe a draft at this stage, because remember, we won't have acquired a lot of the resources until we get into execution. And so the team charter needs to be something that's negotiated amongst the team members. So therefore, this is a starting document, but not necessarily the final document. Now, of course, we have the estimating, and whenever we see estimating, remember the basis of the estimates. So in this case, we need the resource requirements. So we estimate the activity resources, and now we have the resource requirements, but also, as we said, the basis of those estimates. Okay, so you can see it quite straightforward there. Now we have one more down here, which is a resource breakdown structure, an RBS if you want, and not a risk breakdown structure, but a resource breakdown structure, which gives me like an org chart of the types of resources, mechanical, personal, different types of resources that we might want. You might even have that broken down into the types of engineers, types of coders, types of plant equipment that we need. Now, obviously in plant communications management, it's going to be straightforward. It's the communications management plan. And let me just bring up the stakeholders, and then we have stakeholder engagement plan. So we have plant stakeholder management, we have the stakeholder engagement plan. Now you can see here that we have a lot to do with procurement. And I'm going to put these down. There's no order to these. Obviously in the PMBOK, there's no priorities, but it's just that they might make it easier for you to remember them. So the first one, and I think it makes sense, will be the procurement management plan. That makes sense because we plan procurement management, and it'll be procurement management plan. Now there might also be a procurement strategy. Okay, that would be something that I hope would be part of your organizational process assets, and also source selection criteria. So the source selection criteria are the rules, if you want, that you're going to use to select the vendors when you get into execution and you do the bidding process. Okay. Now we also have things like the bid documents. They're the things that you're going to send out to the different vendors. Okay, whether it's drawings, whether it's specifications and trainings and stuff like that, and drawings. The procurement statements of work, the actual SOWs themselves. Of course, that's really helpful to have. Now you have make or buy decisions. So recognizing that when we went back to the work breakdown structure, we saw the work packages, we decided to make or buy each of the work breakdown structure, each of the work packages, and therefore we've made a decision. And I think it's just capturing those decisions to say yes, make or buy, and potentially why as well. Now, independent cost estimates is a useful thing to have, to say that we kept a record of those at the time. It will definitely help us to build up our estimating database. And again, you can see here change requests. Again, you follow my logic. I think change requests should be something kept over here when we're working more formally, but at this stage, we haven't even finished planning. So this is the end of planning. I'm going to take a break. Hopefully you'll see it for what it is, that we have the outputs here in planning, and then I'm going to do the outputs in executing, controlling, and closing as one module, okay? Looking forward to seeing you in the next video.